Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Mark My Brain. Today's topic will be all about understanding loneliness in the modern world. And similarly to the very first episode of this podcast, where we discussed nostalgia and understanding nostalgia, today we are going to explore the topic of loneliness and its role in today's world. Because even though we live in a more connected world than ever before, with all the technology, social media, and internet in general, I have a feeling, based on conversations with friends and overall sentiment of society, I would say, that people often feel more alone than ever before, or that loneliness is a very prevalent thing today. Hence, I want to explore this issue more closely, see where the data stands, and find some answers to questions like why do we even feel lonely? What purpose has loneliness played in our evolution? Why do people fear more alone today, if it's true? What are the causes of modern widespread loneliness and how to fight against it? So, let's start with the basics. When talking about loneliness, it's not just about being objectively alone in a physical space with no people around, but it's more about the subjective emotional state. Behind loneliness emerges a fundamental human need for meaningful connection, and the meaningful is important here. Cognitive perspective then conceptualizes loneliness as arising from the gap or discrepancy between desired relationships, so relationships how we want them to be, and our actual social relationships, how they actually are. So this would explain why we can feel very alone even in a room full of people. Our desire for how the situation or our relationship with all these other people should look like is different from how it actually is. The people are treating us differently. We don't get the attention we feel we should have. You don't feel any connection to the people around you, etc. So again, it's about this subjective emotional state rather than the objective reality itself. And this is, I think, where the quotes that you can often see on social media, for example, how do you explain loneliness that comes not from having nobody around, but from not being understood, come from? It again highlights the difference between the objective and the subjective loneliness we just talked about. And I would add that it also points to the fact that it seems that the objective loneliness is much less of a problem than the subjective one. And why? That's a pretty easy answer, because the feeling of loneliness is commonly linked to emotions like anxiety, fear, shame, helplessness, sadness, and a sense of not being understood. Well, here we are again. And the problem is that this all can create sort of a downward spiral. These negative emotions lead to withdrawal from social contact, which increases loneliness and sort of reinforces the negative thoughts and in turn negative behaviors. It's a pretty nasty cycle. And me personally, I have to say that this is something I have to be very careful about, because now with this knowledge, when I look back, I can see this process sort of happening in several periods of my life. So yeah, it's not a great thing, I would say. And one of the reasons why it works like this in this sort of cycle can be something that modern psychological models propose. Experiencing loneliness triggers hypervigilance for social threats, which then fundamentally changes how individuals perceive their social environment and people around them. Lonely individuals tend to view the social world as more threatening, expect more negative social interactions, and also remember more negative social information. So these attention and memory biases, how we can call them, then contribute to the pessimistic expectations about social interactions. So then people often unconsciously behave in a way that elicits rejection or distance from others. Again, it creates a cycle or a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you want. So that all sounds very fucking unpleasant. Why would we even have these systems and mechanisms built into our biology, right? And to answer that, we'll of course look at loneliness from the evolutionary perspective. So research suggests that loneliness evolved as a social signal system, similar to hunger or thirst, for example, designed to motivate us to seek social connection when we become isolated. And this makes sense since being part of a group meant increased odds of survival in our past, right? And this piece of information would also explain why, with feelings of loneliness and social isolation, our hypervigilance kicks in. Again, because it was a survival tool, because when you're alone, you don't have other members of the tribe, so to speak, to rely on to keep watch for potential threats. So you alone, you have to be extra careful. And that's why I think that the hypervigilance makes sense in this scenario. However, the same evolutionary mechanisms that once promoted our survival can, as we see nowadays, can become very maladaptive to modern context. The hypervigilance for social threats that might have protected isolated individuals in ancestral environments can now lead to social anxiety, for example, misinterpretation of neutral social cues as threatening, and overall behaviors that actually push others away. That's where we see the downward spiral sort of kick in. The evolutionary perspective also helps explain why loneliness is such a powerful and unpleasant emotion. Because such as physical pain motivates us to avoid harmful situations and seek healing, emotional pain from loneliness motivates us to avoid isolation and seek social connection, because at the end of the day, we've evolved as social animals, right? So, okay, now we have some answers to why. Why is it happening? What even is happening? How to view loneliness when we talk about it. So now let's jump back into today's world and age and see some of the data and trends. Recent research reveals alarming trends in loneliness prevalence, particularly among younger generations. For example, a global study conducted by Gallup and Meta Platforms, surveying over 204,000 participants across 142 countries, found that 25% of individuals between the ages of 15 and 18 report feeling very lonely or fairly lonely, with these rates climbing to 27% among people aged between 19 and 29. And what was interesting is that individuals over 65 experience the lowest loneliness rates at 17%. That's a pretty big difference. And this sort of challenges the common assumption about aging and social isolation. Interesting, right? Then American Psychiatric Association polled data and confirmed basically these concerning trends, with 1/3 of adults reporting weekly experiences of loneliness, representing an increase, even just in 1 year, from 30% in 2024 to 33% in 2025. That to me is crazy. Like 1/3 of the whole population feels lonely today. That's sort of sad. And the data also reveals interesting paradoxes in how people today seek connection. While 58% of young adults turn to social media when feeling lonely, overall, the adults prefer in person interactions over online connections. This, of course, suggests that although social media and technology promise a connection with the whole world in the palm of our hand, it fails to satisfy the fundamental human desire for meaningful connections. An unfortunate thing also is that loneliness has been already tied to numerous health problems, not only mental but also physical ones. So now, tied up with the statistics, like 1/3 of people in the world feel lonely, sort of commonly, and it becomes pretty concerning, at least from my point of view. So let's look at what the research reveals about these health problems. Chronic loneliness is linked to increased risk of cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, obesity, even weakened immune response, and overall higher mortality. Meta-analysis involving over 2.2 million people demonstrate that social isolation increases all-cause mortality risk by 26%, while loneliness increases mortality risk by 14%. I guess there's a slight difference between social isolation and loneliness. And for individuals with heart disease, social isolation specifically correlates with a higher mortality risk, while both isolation and loneliness increase cancer-related deaths. And the mechanisms behind these cardiovascular effects involve chronic activation of stress response systems. Loneliness triggers elevation in stress hormones like cortisol, which over time damage arterial walls, leading to all of the aforementioned. And interestingly, loneliness also impacts cognitive functions, like attention or executive functions, like decision making, for example, which I guess makes sense given the hypervigilant state you are in when lonely. It sort of takes the energy that you could have otherwise potentially put into, like, for example, decision making, right? And last but not least, loneliness, of course, also has an effect on mental health problems. We already mentioned that loneliness is tied to feelings of increased anxiety or depression. But what's interesting is that the effect, even causation, appears to be bidirectional. Loneliness can cause mental health problems like anxiety and depression, while those can lead to increased social isolation and loneliness. Again, we can see how that can sort of cycle, right? And an experiment that hypnotically induced loneliness in individuals found that induced loneliness not only increased depressive symptoms, but also elevates perceived stress, fear of negative evaluation, anxiety, and anger, while diminishing optimism and self-esteem. It truly seems like the meaningful social connectedness is one of the key pillars for our emotional well-being, from all that I've just now read, right? So that's cool and all, but after I just spilled all of this negative information about loneliness, what is there to do, right? It may seem daunting, especially in that global perspective, but I truly believe that because loneliness is a very subjective feeling, as we talked about in the beginning, it all starts with you and your social circle. Practical and small everyday things you can do to fight this modern epidemic is, for example, simply keeping in touch with your friends, family, or loved ones, being proactive in your communication, but also in the desire for social connection. Make plans, take initiative, and create a trip you can go on with your friends. Invite them over for a coffee, don't just text from time to time. Or alternatively, join a group focused on some interest or hobby of yours where you can find like-minded individuals, and the interest or common interest can help you create those meaningful connections. I feel like the proactivity and initiative are extremely important here because they directly break that nasty cycle of downward spiral of isolation we talked about. And the great thing about this is that actively trying and challenging the negative thoughts about loneliness can actually create an upward spiral that increases social engagement and meaning in your life. As the as the Stoics say, you become what you pay attention to. So keep that in mind, I would say. It's also vital, I think, with the knowledge you and I gained today, to distinguish between the real, meaningful connections and the digital, sort of lesser version of them. Although it is, of course, nice to at least shoot a message to a friend when there's no option to see them in real life, remember that it's not a full value substitute for real connection, and in the long run, it probably won't be enough for sort of your soul. So don't rely on the digital connectiveness too much. Focus on and cultivate and cherish the real one as well. Overall, if we look at research, the most effective strategies of fighting against loneliness focus on changing the unhelpful thoughts and behaviors, building social skills, and increasing meaningful engagements, rather than just increasing the number of social contacts. Which again makes sense since we talked about in the beginning how loneliness is more about the subjective experience rather than objective reality. Interestingly, or interesting bit of information that also emerged from research is that volunteering is apparently highly effective in this regard because it provides social contact as well as a sense of meaning through helping others. So something that can be interesting to try then. Okay, so that was a lot of information. And now nearing the end of today's episode, what are some key takeaways? It seems that the issue of loneliness is more globally widespread than it may seem at first glance, creating all sorts of mental as well as physical problems. We first took a look at it from a psychological perspective, getting to know what exactly it is and how does it work. We talked about that it's more about a subjective reality rather than the objective one, that it can create all sorts of downward spirals and cycles that it can be hard to break away from. We then tied that information up with evolutionary point of view on loneliness, exploring some ways it was useful for us in the past, the hypervigilance or the motivation to connect again to some group because it increased our rates of survival. But to contrast that past usefulness, recent statistics and research showed us how loneliness can become a huge problem in today's society and why exactly. Right, we went over all the different health problems, the cardiovascular, the mental, even the cognitive ones it can cause. As well as the statistics of the rates at which adults or young adults especially feel lonely in their everyday life. And to fight that issue and to finish on a positive note, we then turned our attention to some practical ways of how to reduce sense of loneliness in our own lives, which I think is the beginning of, reverting that trend. Again, those can be very small things like keeping in touch with your friends, staying proactive, and keeping initiative in your relationships, or making meaningful connections one of your priorities in your life. In last week's episode, I talked about happiness and fulfillment in life. And from all we've discussed today, loneliness or social connectiveness rather, seems to be tightly connected to that topic as well. Probably because behind all the complex emotional, evolutionary, cognitive and psychological mechanisms that run inside of us lies a very fundamental human desire for meaningful social connection and sense of belonging. And with that, this episode comes to an end. I wish you all the best in all your relationships. Cherish and cultivate them. I hope you learned something interesting today. As always, let me know your thoughts about this topic. And until next time, take care. Bye.